Good afternoon. Welcome to the second installment of Reimagining the City-University Connection. We had a very intense, vibrant morning, but gave you a little bit of a break, so give you some lunch, and we have lots of coffee to get us through the afternoon and into the reception. So bear with us. And I'm really pleased to introduce this session, which is entitled Improving Urban Education. And similar to the sessions this morning, we've tried to pair academics with people working in policy, and so I think it'll be a very interesting conversation. I'm going to turn it over to the moderator, and all the bios, by the way, are in your booklet, so I'm not going to read you all the many things I could say about Nancy Hill, very accomplished scholar. She's a developmental psychologist, currently professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute. And she has many research accomplishments, but in light of getting onto the panel, I'm sure she'd be happy if I just turned it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. It's been a really wonderful morning, and as I've listened to all the panel, there's some key themes that keep coming up, and there are issues around trust, and partnerships, and evaluations. And as I looked at the map that Felton Earls put up, that showed the common places and locations for low birth weight and homicides, I think our panelists, we kind of agreed that those are probably the locations of the most challenged schools as well. And so as we think about collaborations between universities and the cities, and how can we think about how that kind of collaboration can improve urban education? And indeed, the vast majority of American youth are educated in schools in urban areas. And we have a very distinguished panel to talk about these issues, and I will introduce them very briefly. As Rob mentioned, the full biographies are in your program. First, we have Stephen Raudenbush, who is the Louis Sebring Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Sociology and Chair of the Committee on Education at the University of Chicago. And in addition to being on the cutting edge in developing methodological and statistical techniques, to look at these issues, he also does research on the development of literacy and math skills. He will go first. Next, we will have Sarah Glover, who is the Executive Director of the Strategic Data Project at the Center for Educational Policy and Research right here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And in addition to her accomplishments, her center is involved in doing deep and rigorous analysis of the kind of fundamental issues and processes for developing policy and management decisions, so using data to inform policies and programs. Third, we have Catherine Snow, who's the Patricia Augberg Graham Professor of Education here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She's a developmental psychologist and studies language development and its relationship to literacy, and also looking at monolingual, multilingual, and bilingual education and children from socioeconomically diverse contexts. And fourth, we have Carol R. Johnson, who is the current superintendent of the Boston Public Schools. And among her many accomplishments, under her leadership, the district has focused on closing the achievement gap. And indeed, right now, it has the lowest dropout rate in the last 2 decades under her leadership. And so we have Carol Johnson. I think that's worthy of an applause. Who will speak forth, and without further ado, Steve, please.
So, I don't know how many of you listen to car talk on the radio, but I do, and they usually start with the puzzler, right? Or as I say, the puzzler. And they're from Boston, so I thought I would start with the puzzle. So the University of Chicago, where I am, is a comparatively small research-intensive university, small in the, out of the research-intensive universities around the country. 5,000 undergraduates, relatively few of whom will go into teaching. We have no school of education. The School of Education was abolished in 1979 and became a Department of Education within the Division of Social Sciences. But in 1996, the Department of Education was abolished, so we don't have a Department of Education. We do have a small Committee on Education, which I chair, which has 14 faculty, a wonderful distinguished group, all of whom have primary appointments in one of the disciplines, none of whom has a primary appointment in education. And yet, despite this seemingly extremely modest involvement of education in the university's Urban Education Institute employs over 300 people, runs 4 schools on the south side of Chicago, 2 elementary, a middle school, and a high school. And these are schools that are entrance by lottery. It's basically all African-American schools, 85% low income. The university runs an ambitious teacher training program. 95% of the people who graduate go into positions in the Chicago public schools and stay there after 5 years. The retention rate is very high. The university maintains a data archive with annual test results on every child who has been in the Chicago public schools since 1991, and runs a citywide survey of teachers, kids, and administrators every 2 years, and does frequent sophisticated policy analysis for the Chicago public schools. And we've just launched a new urban education lab to study, using rigorous experimental methods, new policy options and innovations in the city. So the puzzle is, how could such a university with such a modest footprint, seemingly in education, actually have such a big footprint in education? And why does it do these things? We'll never train more than a tiny fraction of the 21,000 plus teachers in the city, and we'll never run more than a tiny fraction of the 675 schools in the city. So why do we do this stuff? One explanation involves community relations, and my former colleague and good friend Hank Weber in the next session will say something about this. Being on the south side of Chicago, it's in the university's interest to be a good neighbor, a better neighbor than it used to be. It wasn't such a good neighbor, hasn't been. Having good schools and having public safety are 2 of the things that make a neighborhood viable, and the university also has a rather large police force. And having good schools that aren't attended by the faculty, actually, but that are attended by people in the local area is in the interest of the university, and having this police force is. So certainly the university's institutional interest is part of the explanation for why the university would be involved in schools. But the scale of the effort goes way beyond what you would need to do in order to do civic engagement. And so the way we've come to see this, and the way we articulate it and argue for it, is that our aim is a quintessentially University of Chicago aim. It's to produce knowledge. That's why we're doing these things. We want to produce knowledge about schooling, and particularly, how do we create the best possible schooling for some of the nation's most disadvantaged kids. And the university administration has taken this on as one of its very few major sort of signature projects. I'd like to think of this as being kind of the Manhattan Project of the 2000s, hopefully with much more positive results than the first Manhattan Project. So what is the model? There's the central aim. I got a little bit behind. When I say the model, how does a university organize itself to produce knowledge about schooling? And here's what we have at least tentatively concluded. The first thing we've concluded is that, we call it exemplary practice, that you need to run schools. And not too many universities run schools, and not on the scale that we run them. But we think that you have to put your ideas to a test. You have to see whether, if you put your views of developmental psychology for early reading into practice, does it work? Can you make it happen? Your ideas from organizational sociologists about how do you organize the school as an organization, does it work? Your way of incentivizing teachers to work hard, testing out your best ideas from labor economics, does it work? Can you put it together? If it works, to the extent it works, it's good. And if it doesn't work, then you don't know what you thought you knew in some level or another. You can't put these things together. And that means you have new questions you have to answer. So that's one of the ways you produce knowledge. And you also have to work on changing so you create your own schools, and that's a challenge. You can't blame anybody if it's your school and it doesn't work, right? So you need to do that. We also think you need to work closely together, studying other people's attempts to change existing schools. So exemplary practice is one. In terms of research, we think that having basic science, people who do basic science in children's language learning, like I said, labor market economics, organizational sociology, that having those people talking to each other and occasionally, and as often as possible, talking to practitioners and people who are running schools is another piece of the puzzle. That's the basic science. And then we think that you need to train teachers in the schools you run. So if you have a specific way of teaching mathematics or teaching reading or teaching science that you think is, according to your research, the optimal way to teach these kids, and that's what you're doing in your schools, then the people you're training are learning to teach that way. A key problem in ed schools and in the training of teachers around the country is that we train teachers in a very decentralized system. They can parachute anywhere, and they might be expected to teach anything. And so we've kind of taken an opposite view that you're going to be certified to teach a specific way, and we're going to try to place you in a place that wants to use that approach. So the most common question that I get when I say these things is, okay, suppose you run a small number of boutique schools right near the university. Actually, they're not that near. And you have a small teacher training program, and maybe they work better than average. How is that going to scale? And so that's why we think it's essential to constantly be studying the attempts that many other people make to improve schools. And that's the applied research agenda, the Chicago Consortium for School Research, which for 20 years, my old friend and colleague Tony Breik, who used to be at Harvard at one point, is the person who started that consortium and founded the first charter school, and that has been a very exciting endeavor where you can learn a lot from other people's experience. Of course, the other thing researchers can do that practitioners can't do is synthesize what's happening around the country and around the globe and bring that and create and inject those findings into the conversations that occur locally. So Rob Sampson asked me to do this and asked me to give a couple of examples of research in this agenda. So I'm going to give two if I have time. The first is a book that a couple of colleagues, Lisa Rosen and Elizabeth Hastrick and I are writing, which we call The Ambitious Elementary School, where we talk about what we think the role of schooling is in helping overcome educational inequality. It's based on a theory about the early roots of inequality and cognitive skill, which begin in the vast array of homes of people where parents vary dramatically in terms of their own education, and kids come in a very heterogeneous group of kids come into the schooling system, and what does the elementary school need to do to make things right? And so I could talk, and having, as you imagine, having written this book, I could talk for hours about this. And I asked myself, how can I summarize this model of instruction in these schools in a simple way? And I think the simplest way to summarize it is to say, at least the ideal is this, that all of the adults in the school are collectively responsible for the learning of every child in the school. That's the essence of it. So what that means is that teachers have to abandon the famous autonomy, the privacy of their practice, which is the norm in American schools, and embrace instead a common instructional system based on a theory of what kids need to know and when they need to know it, the backbone of which is an assessment system which tells us whether and to what extent children in each grade are on track, for example, children in kindergarten, first, second grade, to become good readers by the time they're in third grade. And so we want to know every step of the way, are these children, where are they on this trajectory? And if they're not making adequate progress, then what are we going to do? What kind of supports are we going to organize? And so we organized the instruction around the frequent assessments of children's skills. The idea is that, when I say we, I have nothing to do with running these schools, which is probably a very good thing, and really my colleague Tim Knowles, his mother is here somewhere, and you should be very proud of his work. He's the one who's doing it, but we're studying these schools. But the idea is that all of the teachers are aware of the progress that all of the kids are making, and it becomes poignantly obvious when a particular teacher is having a hard time getting kids to move from one place to the other, and there are ways in which that teacher gets lots of help. All the teachers are able to get a lot of help in this system, and it's not in the interest of our schools to have people who don't respond well to that help staying in the schools. Is a brutal fact of life. But if you're going to have effective schools for very disadvantaged kids, you have to have terrific practice. So the idea is to develop this model, and we test it through annual lotteries. And we have experimental data in this citywide database, kids flowing through the schools, our schools, and flowing through schools that they otherwise attend if they lost the lottery. And I'm not going to go into detail on those results here. I can't yet. It's not quite ready for prime time. We're quite happy with the results, but I can't say too much more. Next time we have this conference, I'll tell you a lot about that study. Let me give you one other example of the other kind of research, which is not about the schools we run, but rather about this large number of 675 schools in the city of Chicago. And it's just a very interesting history of reforming the high school math curriculum. And it has two chapters, two epics, I guess you could say. In 1997, the school system inaugurated a new policy called Algebra for All. Prior to that, in some schools, all ninth graders took algebra, but in lots of other schools, a lot of kids were taking a very sort of low-level remedial arithmetic kind of course instead of algebra. And the idea of Algebra for All would give everybody access to academic algebra. And one of the interesting side effects of this was that it desegregated the classrooms on the basis of ability. So when all of these kids who would have otherwise not have algebra came into the classrooms of all these other kids, suddenly you have much more heterogeneous classrooms. And in a nutshell, on average, there was very little evidence that the effect helped the kids who were supposed to be who were getting algebra for the first time. And there was some evidence that the kids who were the higher ability kids actually suffered from having more heterogeneous classrooms. You have to imagine, in a city where kids are so underprepared mathematically, if you're prepared to really do algebra and you have a whole bunch of kids who don't know arithmetic, it's very, very difficult for the teacher. So in 2003, based on a lot of research and feedback, the city inaugurated a new policy called double dose algebra. So the idea was if everyone who scored below a certain cut point was required to take two periods of algebra. So the idea is that you would have a period of sort of the remedial stuff that you would need so that you would have enough proficiency so that you could actually benefit from the algebra class. And so the consortium has done a number of studies of this. We're actually doing more studies of this whole history. It's quite fascinating. One of the interesting things that happened when double-dose algebra was inaugurated was that it resegregated the classrooms to some extent on the basis of child ability, because when you had to schedule the low-achieving kids back-to-back in terms of their math classes, it actually sort of cascaded through the whole scheduling process, and you end up with classrooms being tracked more on the basis of ability. And so what we're now finding, and what we knew already, and we've known for quite a while, is that double-dose algebra was really quite a remarkably effective intervention for kids who scored below the cut, or around the cut point, let's say, using what we call a regression discontinuity design. Fancy thing that we have. If we can't do an experiment, it's probably the next best thing. Study the kids who are in the neighborhood of the cut point. The kids who scored above the cut point did quite remarkably better. However, what we now know is that schools implemented this policy very differently. In some schools, they did the scheduling in such a way that there was a lot of tracking, and in other schools, there wasn't. And in the schools where they scheduled the kids so that they didn't have the ability segregation. The effect was very large, very promising. So we learned something about curriculum, and we're learning something about what we call in our business tracking, which is really the segregation of classrooms on the basis of ability. And it's a tricky problem because from Algebra for All, we know that the higher achieving math kids seem to suffer from having more heterogeneous classes, but we see that in double dose algebra that if you do the policy well and you don't have as much tracking, the kids who are in the sort of the lower level kids are doing much, much better. So those are just a couple of examples. But what I want to paint for you is a picture of simultaneously studying your own practice very carefully, very locally, in a very intensive setting that you control, which has strengths and limitations, and then extensively studying the practice in a much bigger system that you don't control as much, but a lot of other people are doing interesting things, and then trying to figure out what you're learning. It's quite a wonderful place to be if you're an educational researcher. So what are the problems? And how much time do I have? I have 3 minutes, okay, well, I'm gonna finish on time, I think. So, although don't get me started. So one of the problems is, how do you sustain this ambitious kind of commitment of the university? And one thing that we're convinced is that soft money won't do it. If you have to support yourself by winning grants, and we do get a lot of grants, you're inevitably going to be pulled in the direction of your questions sort of going where the money is. So we think you have to endow this, and that means you have to raise a lot of money. We have to raise probably $150 million in endowment to do this. So it's a very expensive project. Not for Harvard, but for us it is. Another big problem is the political economy of teacher training. So, and I'm going to say something nice about ed schools in a minute. I don't mean to be critical, but I think that ed schools are in a tough position because most of the ed schools, not the Harvard Ed School, because I'm talking about the ed schools that train most of the nation's teachers. You have large undergraduate student body. A bunch of those kids want to be teachers. They supply a big revenue base for the ed school to train those teachers. The incentive is to bring everybody in and turn out as many people as you can. Use the tuition money to support all of your operations, any research you're going to do, keep the whole operation going. And it's not clear that inflicting all of those people in that way on the labor market is the best way to improve the stock of the nation's teachers. We have to think of a better way of doing it. It's a really big structural problem. We have some other problems in Chicago that you actually don't have. I talked to Carol about this the other day. We have very low per pupil spending in Chicago, so we actually have to raise money. We have to raise a couple $1,000s per kid to get the per pupil spending up to where we think it has to be for us to do the good job that we think we can do. And of course, the big problems, and I guess this is the topic of today, is how do we capture the imagination of the best universities to take the lead in doing this kind of work. And so, in conclusion, let me say something about the prospects, which is that I'm not recommending that other universities follow in Chicago's footsteps and close their schools of education. I think it would be a disaster if that were to happen, because the schools of education are still very plausibly going to be the major organizational vehicle through which this university commitment that I think we need to have is going to take shape. But I think that it's something for us to talk about, is how do we create a much stronger commitment of the university. And I think we have to start with the leading universities to make these commitments so that it's more like the commitment that a university has to medicine, where you have a teaching hospital, where you study your practice, you try to create the best clinical practice, and you train people according to that. I think we need to do the same thing in schools. I'll be interested to hear if my colleagues agree. And so we have to ask the question, I think, that I began with, and I'm not saying that I have the right answer, but I think we have to ask the question, how does a university produce knowledge about this question of how to create outstanding schooling? And that we should take this as seriously as we would take the challenge to find a cure of cancer. I just saw a whole edition of the Science magazine demography from around the world, predicting the world's population, looking at many different countries, going through their what's called the demographic transition, which is where countries move that are very, very poor to having smaller family sizes, having much better public health, and becoming much more productive. And it's one of the, probably the most unanimous thing that you can find in all of those articles is that maternal education is the most important investment that you can make to achieve those goals. And so we've talked a lot about public health today, and the interface between the necessity of education in producing public health on a mass scale is something that we should take very seriously. Thank you.
Good afternoon. What a delight to be here. What a delight to have the after lunch slot to talk about education policy. Jennifer gets to casually throw out, sex ads on Craigslist during her talk, and we don't really have that punch. Let me just get a feel for who's here. I'd love to. We're here for sort of city-university partnerships. Just raise your hand if you're sort of on the university side. Okay. What about city, including school district? What about nonprofit? What about who haven't I covered? Private. Wow, how did I miss that? And how many of you are involved in partnerships now? All right, and just really quick, like 0, it's really troubling you, 5, it's on fire, everything is great. Just give me like a, 3 is in the middle. Yeah, a lot of 3s, 4. Oh, we should talk to that guy. You should be up here. Okay, so for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about the Strategic Data Project, which is a project that we run out of the Center for Education Policy Research here at the Graduate School of Education. Some of you may be thinking that this panel, which Rob professed to have a lot of diversity on it, is really academic heavy. Just read my background. I'm actually not an academic. I'm sort of the doer, the conduit, if you will, between sort of the academics in our shop and all the practitioners who we partner with across the country. Our mission is to transform the use of data in education to improve student achievement. Sort of the big idea, our big idea that this mission is premised upon is that there is just a lot of opportunity in the education sector, partly because of the vast amounts of data that have been collected fairly recently. No Child Left Behind gets beat up on a lot, but it has generated a lot of data for us. But also because of this, right? And I think probably in all of our different sectors, whether education or not, we struggle with the issue that data gets chunked and siloed and housed in different places. For us, the result of this is that it's actually really hard to do the kind of analysis that we recommend and that, frankly, a lot of our partners desire. We sit around the table with superintendents and chief accountability officers, and they say, well, we want X. And then we say, well, you don't have the data to do X. And the separation of data is one set of issues, but actually a thing that we encounter that has as much impact on sort of limiting the work that we can do is the people separation. Right? Who has access to the data? And when I was thinking about saying this, I was like, well, that just sounds like a small issue. It just does. But it is so pivotal. In fact, one of the things that we're starting to do with people is to literally map out people's relationships to data so that we can see sort of where the blockages are. Sometimes they're very formal, and there's, for sometimes good reasons around privacy and FERPA, the Federal Education Privacy around student information. Those access points need to be really carefully controlled. Other times it's just historical and ownership and turf and that type of thing. In fact, one of my strategies in one district is to bring a favorite Starbucks drink to the person who I need to influence the most. And it turns out that opens up the data gate. So small things can matter sometimes too. So the point of this is that some big, management and policy questions from our standpoint get sort of forced into what we would call tangential answers. So, quick example, talking about teacher training that Steve put on the table. A district knows, most districts know where they get most of their teachers from. Most districts don't know whether those teachers are the best teachers over time or whether they're the least effective teachers. They don't have the ability to do that analysis. So that's what we mean by sort of tangential answers. We design our work around this theory of action. The notion that if we can bring together sort of the right people, meaning really talented, creative, thoughtful analysts around the right data, making some breakthroughs on these silo infrastructure issues, and then combine that with the right analysis, meaning really rigorous thinking about what to do with this data, that it will vastly improve, frankly, the quality of decisions that are being made in education today. So what does this actually look like? How does the theory of action kind of work on the ground? To address sort of the right people aspect, we place fellows in our partner agencies. And I'll tell you who our partners are in a minute, but we're in 10 districts, 2 states, 1 network of charter schools. So we have about 45 fellows across the country. We do 2 things. Fellows enter our fellowship through kind of 2 doorways. One is we do a national recruiting and really vet people with some rigorous analytic tasks, and then place those people as new employees in the district or the state for 2 years. And the second thing is we invite every partner to identify 2 existing employees to participate as fellows fully in the fellowship. So in most places, there's a team of 4 fellows on the ground, and 2 of whom have been in the agency for a while and, are building careers in that agency. So that's a very fundamental piece of how we conceptualize the partnership, but also our notion of sort of what it means to truly build capacity in that place. So for the right analysis, we have a research team based at SERP. We developed 2 sets of what we would call diagnostic analyses. One's in the area of human capital, mostly focused on teacher effectiveness, questions of teacher effectiveness. And the second is in what we call college-going success, so really looking at the pathways of students through high school and then out of high school, and what does post-secondary look like. And we replicate these analyses in each place. And so the reason I'm smiling is because sometimes I call it the big box solution. Hi, we've got these great set of analyses. And with our district, one of the reasons we do it is as a demonstration project. Look, here's what you can do with your data if you think about it differently. The second, obviously, is to generate the findings, not just for the partner district, but also across districts, right? So when we're doing this in 10 places, we can look at how the findings compare. We do involve the fellows very tightly in this work so that those folks are positioned to kind of customize or do deeper dives on these analyses to make them more salient and sort of pertinent to the specific district and the decisions they're facing. So the right data piece is a challenge, but also changing really fast as state laws are changing, federal laws around requirements for what districts need to collect. But one of the things we did as a necessary building block was create data specification, right, for our diagnostic analyses. But it turns out this has been a really helpful tool. So LA is one of our partner districts, and they're using our data spec to build out their next generation of their human capital management system to make sure they're actually collecting the data they need to. Whoops. So here's where our partners are, as I was mentioning, 10 districts, and very importantly, Boston, with Dr. Johnson's leadership, ushered us into Boston. So there's a team of 4 fellows on the ground in Boston Public Schools and have been there for about 1.5 years. Just recently, we initiated a partnership with the state of Massachusetts as well. I should mention before I share a couple pieces of a couple findings with you is, in addition to the 45 fellows, we're sort of looking. This is where Dr. Johnson has the perfect right to look across the table and be sort of like stay in your role in this partnership. But we're looking for more infiltration points, right, with our partners. So we're really building a network with those fellow supervisors as well, and trying to connect them with each other, sort of communities of practice, and also back to our work. Okay, so I thought I would, as Rob instructed us about how to kind of deliver our remarks, I thought I'd share a couple of things that we've developed in our analyses. As I mentioned, we do analyses in 2 areas. This is human capital. We look at 5 stages in a teacher's career, recruitment, placement, development, evaluation, and sort of retention and turnover. So what I'm going to share is an analysis that we do in placement. So placement means which teachers are with which kids, and how do school districts think about that. So looking at this chart, starting on the x-axis, you see we have results here for 4 districts. District D isn't there because, it turns out they don't track, this is for math scores, they don't track a teacher of record in elementary schools for math. They track homeroom teachers, but not math teachers. So we couldn't be sure that those teachers who are homeroom teachers are actually teaching those kids math. So it was like, okay, we need to start tracking that if we want to be able to do this analysis. There's sometimes it's that basic of what emerges when we do these analyses. So what we're looking at here is obviously the results along the x-axis. The y-axis shows us the difference between the previous test scores of kids who are assigned to novice teachers in the classroom for the first time, versus the kids' previous test scores who have teachers who have 4 years or more experience. So imagine that we on the panel got placed in a classroom with a teacher who's first year of teaching. So the blue bar represents the difference between our last year's test scores and your last year's test scores, right? You guys all got placed with teachers with 4 years more experience. We got placed with the novice teacher. It turns out that very systematically, as you can see here, lower performing kids are placed with novice teachers. Okay, so the blue bar, just sticking with that, indicates overall or a district-wide measure. In other words, part of what it's telling us is about turnover in hard-to-staff schools. So pretty well understood that in hard-to-staff schools where there are sometimes much lower performing kids, there's more novice teachers. But this is why we pair this analysis with a within-school measure. So the red bar shows us how that the gap between prior year test scores of kids with novice teachers versus kids' prior year test scores with more experienced teachers. And what we see is that in all of these 3 of the 4 districts, it remains a statistically significant gap. So what we say to superintendents and to folks who are sort of in charge of placement issues is, so, A, did you know this? And usually the answer is no. Across district, yes, they know that. The within schools, this is news. And then we say, so what do you think about the notion of strategically placing teachers with kids to improve student achievement? And they say, well, yeah, this isn't it. So what does it mean to strategically place teachers with kids to improve student achievement? Sometimes that's a new question. Let's see, we did the same analysis for middle schools, and you can see here that the patterns are more pronounced, both across the district, the blue bars, as well as the within schools measure, the red bars. And our notion here, though we haven't followed this up with surveys or anything, is that this probably represents the advent of tracking. Starting to push higher performing kids into more advanced courses and more experienced teachers teaching those courses. And so the important thing about this is we marry this with an analysis that we do in districts, but also a well-developed body of research that tells us that novice teachers are less effective in their first year on average than teachers with 3 or 4 years experience. So again, it's teeing up this question about what does it mean to think about teacher placement as a strategy for improving student achievement. Okay, so let me share one from our college-going diagnostic. For me, this one offers hope, a lot of hope. We've talked about a lot of depressing things today. People keep opening with how things are difficult in Washington and the economy and everything. I think this gives us some actions really to consider. So in the college-going diagnostic, we look at 4 transitions for students as they go through high school. 9th to 10th grade, which is a critical kind of transition point, high school graduation, college enrollment, and college persistence. So what I'm going to share with you is one thing we do on college enrollment. So you can see with this slide, we're trying to do a better job of visually displaying the analysis so that it's more engaging and almost tells a story sort of by itself. Don't need me up here walking us through this stuff. Here we're looking at highly qualified or high-performing high school graduates, and then what they do, where are they the fall after their high school graduation. So in the top left corner of the chart shows sort of the population of kids we're looking at. We're looking at kids who have at least a 3.0 GPA and at least a 1100 on the SAT. So what in your head, maybe it goes off like, oh, that would be a college-going kid, right? So let's look at the results. The chart shows results for 4 districts. The light blue, the longest part of the bar, are those students who enroll in 4-year colleges. Very good news, right? Looking at District A coming in at 90%. This is good news. District B, right? Like significantly different than District A. What's going on there? This is where the comparative stuff, starts to be really useful. And frankly, it's what the districts really care about a lot. So then the turquoise part tells that the students who are enrolled in less selective 4-year colleges, orange is enrolled in 2-year colleges, and then yellow, this is the opportunity that I'm talking about. These kids are not going anywhere. So there's a caveat to every analysis, right? Like this draws off of National Student Clearinghouse data, which covers about 93% of enrolled college kids, so that's not 100%. And also, this doesn't capture students who would enlist in the military. But still, it's like, okay, really? 16% of the kids in District B who are 3.0 or 1100 SAT, no college? Like, this is a place where very targeted intervention seems like it could generate a lot of impact. So quickly looping back to sort of the big idea behind the Strategic Data Project, I would assert that the reason this idea makes sense now is of these 3 reasons. Technology, kind of what we were able to do, and the panel right before lunch sort of artfully described that, so I don't need to repeat what they said. The second is need, right? We've seen these sort of depressing charts about increased expenditure in education, but not, increased achievement. But the world is getting more complex. The skills needed to navigate are changing incredibly rapidly. And we need to really get after this achievement gap, or we are going to be looking at a much more economically stratified society that is from sort of a different age. And what a weird thing that all this progress could create kind of a social society that looks like it's history for us, not the future. The last thing, the reason I think this makes a lot of sense right now is because these huge shifts that are happening in education right now. Many states, more than a dozen states, have passed laws to link teacher evaluation to student data. This is dramatically shifts things in education and opens up opportunities for just different ways of getting the work done. And we think that the role of data analysis in making these decisions is important and powerful. So super quick, some of the challenges we encounter in these partnerships, right? We show up and we're here to help. And oh, by the way, we show up with buckets of money from the Gates Foundation, and we're from Harvard. So it's kind of hard for them to say no. And as we develop the relationships with the districts and are able to have those conversations, a couple of them have said to me, Sarah, you asked us to do this. I'm like, wow. So we have to, when we approach, make sure it's okay for our partner to say, this is not a good time for us, and not to make it politically untenable for them to say no. A second challenge, obviously, is time. No special sauce there. Good partnerships take a lot of time. I find myself, when people call up and say, we should work together, I go, ah, right? Because shaping that, making it concrete, generating value out of that is, it takes a lot of work. There is a lot of value, but I am finding like it pays to be, really, really thoughtful about how to pursue that. Folks have kind of covered these couple of other issues, conflicting agendas. I think it's really easy to start off with the same agenda, but then you peel back the layer a little bit and the agendas aren't quite the same. So being super clear and open and transparent about that, I think, is important. So my time's up. I'm gonna just go, I can't resist to give us 2 to-do items. I'm sort of a freakishly action-oriented person, and sometimes all this talk and conversation and facilitation, I'm like, but yes, and we do what? Because we all have to manage these partnerships. I would suggest two things to you that I have adopted in our practice. One is whether you're on the verge of a partnership or in the middle of a partnership, ask both sides, or if it's a three-way partnership, three sides, to just draft out a scope document really quick, really high level, a couple pages. Don't share it with each other until you're done. Just see if you're on the same page. Just use the scope document to see how close you are. And it generates a really good opportunity, avenue for communication. The second is map out clear goals. Write them down. Put on your calendar on a quarterly or semi-annual basis to revisit those goals. It creates a very nice, solid framework for communication with your partners. Thanks.
I'm here to talk about an organization called SERP, that stands for the Strategic Education Research Partnership. And let me start by saying that I think SERP is based on many of the principles that you heard Steve talk about. The Chicago Consortium for School Research was definitely one model for thinking about SERP. The Strategic Data Project and the other work of CEPR, the acronym of the anagram of SERP, the Center for Education Policy Research, share many features and basic principles. I should say as well that I think if people who were here this morning and heard the panel on violence prevention, you'll see many of the same themes emerging. And in fact, as Nancy said, that we do need to bring together these agendas around public health and around schooling much more closely, because the neighborhoods where kids are subjected to very high levels of stress in utero are neighborhoods where you need exceptionally good preschools to overcome those effects and prepare them for school. The neighborhoods where kids have a lot of asthma are the neighborhoods where absenteeism from school is very high. The neighborhoods where there's a high incidence of violence are the neighborhoods where kids are dropping out of high school early and are failing to pass state accountability assessments. So we shouldn't see these as separate agendas, but as potentially mutually supportive agendas. So what is SERP? Well, SERP is an institution. It's an NGO. It is was incubated at the National Academy of Sciences as the brainchild of the former president of the academies, and who had always felt that it was unfortunate that advances in science, for example, were not getting reflected in advances in science education. It is an effort to promote an alternative model for educational research, not alternative to the kinds of things that Steve and Sarah talked about, but alternative to 95% of the educational research which goes on, which is done in a model that focuses on getting publications, that focuses on the priorities that universities require of its employees, of their employees, and does not start with the question, how do we get schools better? SERP consists of a set of partnerships with school districts. Boston was the first of those partnerships. We thus have a particularly soft spot in our hearts for the Boston partnership, because it was kind of the place where we tried out how to do it and made all the mistakes. And fortunately, with the collaboration of the superintendent when this started, Tom Pezant, and his successors in recent years, Carol Johnson, we've, I think, worked out a set of mechanisms for nurturing those partnerships and keeping them strong. What characterizes SERP research is a commitment to start with urgent problems of practice. If you're the kind of educational researcher I was 15 years ago, you read the journals and you sort of said, oh, gee, Here's 4 different approaches to teaching vocabulary, but there's this little gap here about, is it more important for kids to hear words many, many times, or is it more important for the words to be presented in semantically rich contexts? Maybe I'll do an experiment about that. Well, it's a publishable experiment. I did it, I published it, but it doesn't really connect very powerfully to the issues that Carol Johnson is worried about, or that the principals and teachers in the Boston Public Schools are worried about. So the idea was to turn those processes of deciding what to work on their heads and start with conversations with practitioners. When practitioners nominate urgent problems of practice, we, SERP, agree to deliver the relevant expertise. Fortunately, when we started in Boston in 2004, the problem of practice that the then superintendent, Tom Payson, nominated was middle school literacy. That was fortunate because of the many, many problems he could have suggested, that was the only one in which I had any glimmer of expertise. So I could bring that expertise to bear and recruit colleagues from around the greater Boston area to try to think about that problem. And our approach is to produce tools that districts can use to help address their problems, and use the tools as a mechanism for transferring knowledge from where the tools are built to where the tools might be used. So like the work in Chicago, we do think of ourselves as producing knowledge, but we think of the knowledge as embodied in the curricular assessment and analysis tools that we produce. So one of the basic principles is you produce tools to solve local problems, but you're kind of betting that problems that are urgent in Boston are likely to be urgent in other urban districts as well, and certainly our experience has suggested that. So why do we need SERP? Well, we need SERP basically because there are hundreds of research-based educational practices, programs, curricula, approaches, reform efforts that have been proven effective in small-scale studies. It's not that educational researchers have not produced any knowledge. It's that they haven't produced knowledge that's actually gotten embedded in the DNA of schools. There are, furthermore, and I think this is probably less widely recognized, but to me particularly poignant, there are hundreds of promising practices, innovative practices that are invented and used by practitioners that also go missing after a few years. A great approach to teaching algebra to underperforming high school freshmen, invented by 3 math teachers in a high school in Boston, and the 3 math teachers then, 2 years later, one of them is teaching junior math, and one of them has gone down to middle school, and that really, really effective approach that they've used in their classroom doesn't get used anymore, and there is no mechanism for formally evaluating or institutionalizing that kind of inventiveness, with the result that we don't have a mechanism for treating teachers as producers of knowledge or partners in this agenda of improving schools. So these promising practices, whether researcher-driven or practitioner-driven, typically work in their initial settings. Many of them do not survive translation to multiple classrooms. So that it works in the experimental setting, or it works when the guy who thought it up does it in the classroom, but can an average teacher with an average amount of professional development focused on that new practice do it? Probably not. And even those that do survive that translation to multiple classrooms, or even to entire districts, rarely get institutionalized. They don't survive the transition from the superintendent who adopted them to the next superintendent who wants something else. So there is not this sense in the field of education of an accumulation of ever-improving practices. There's a sense of kind of climbing the hill and sliding back down again quite regularly. So SERP is designed to to at least raise consciousness about and perhaps to help address these issues, that there is a whole lot of research out there, but not enough engineering of the tools to make the research usable. That there's a huge amount of impact, particularly in the current educational research administration, to impact, to evaluating programs, to measuring effect sizes, to using rigorous experimental methods to decide what works and what doesn't work. But in that research effort, there's very little attention to implementation. Right? We know that this program can work, but do we know where it works or how it works or what obstacles have to be overcome to make sure it works? Typically, no. And in fact, the Institute of Education Sciences has spent many millions of dollars over the last 4 or 5 years evaluating adolescent literacy programs. The average effect size across those many millions of dollars has been 0.02. The programs were well designed. The implementation was, in most cases, simply not adequate to be able to find a measurable effect size. And in addition, we think that in a lot of educational research, there's a sort of an attempt to solve the problem with a new curriculum. Kids should be doing this. Or with professional development, teachers should be doing this. Or maybe with district-level reforms, more coherence, move from middle schools to K-8 schools, or move from K-8 schools to elementary and middle schools, or start tracking or stop tracking. And the fact of the matter is that you really, in order to bring about institutionalizable reform, I think, need to think about kids and what they need to know, teachers and what they need to know, and organizations and how they're organized, all simultaneously, because you can interrupt the reform at any of those levels. So how does SERP function in Boston? As I said, we started in 2004 with the full collaboration and cooperation of Tom Pesant. He said, the problem I want you to worry about is middle school literacy. I don't know what to do about it. I know the kids are not improving in literacy skills from 6th through 8th grade, but I don't know why, and I don't know what the problem is. And that is, of course, a very general problem. It's a problem that we had to spend a year kind of turning into a researchable question. We spent a year hanging out in classrooms, talking to principals, talking to teachers, honing the focus and working with the core team of researchers and representatives of the instructional leadership team of the district. And that core team remains a central element in this partnership. We meet regularly to try to coordinate agendas. We also had, at that time, a design team, researchers and practitioners from around the country who we thought were very smart at helping to think about these things, who helped us question representatives from the district and sort of articulate more carefully what they needed from us, but at the same time helped us try to articulate what we could reasonably be expected to provide. We work in Boston with schools that volunteer. The role of the central administration is to offer what we have to schools and let them volunteer to participate with us in our work. There is some central agenda setting, but it is, I would say, minimally directive, at least as relevant to what we do. So what have we accomplished in Boston? Well, we started with this problem of middle school literacy, and talking to teachers, it got narrowed down into a problem of academic vocabulary. The kids, we can teach them, the teachers told us, we can teach them the words they need to know in biology. Photosynthesis I can teach. Executive, legislative, judicial, the history teacher, can teach. But there are a lot of other words in those texts the kids do not understand. And it's hard to teach photosynthesis, the process of conversion of solar energy into nutritional energy, if kids don't know what process means, if they don't know what convert means. Those are the words we need some help with. So we said, okay, we will come up, and we came up with a program called Word Generation that's based around opportunities to teach words in the context of discussion of civic dilemmas. And it has some rather special features, which I don't have time to tell you about, but one of them is that it involves teachers across all the content areas in these middle schools. So it's an attempt to kind of break down the departmental structure of the schools. We implemented word generation in 2 schools, worked very closely with teachers to make it accessible, usable, easy, evaluated our results, found they were good enough to expand it. But at the same time, the teachers kept saying to us, well, we think it's vocabulary, but is it really vocabulary? We really don't know what it is that our kids can't do when they can't read the text. So we said, oh, you mean you want a diagnostic assessment for reading in the middle schools? And they said, yeah, that's what we want. We want a diagnostic reading assessment. So we worked with ETS to develop a diagnostic reading assessment, which we call RISE. RISE stands for Reading, Inventory, and Scholastic Evaluation, but the real reason for it is because we wanted to have something that we could call the SERP Prize. And we took the RISE into schools, administered it across entire populations of school students in different schools, and discovered, to our surprise, that students in this diagnostic assessment did not show the profile of students in many urban districts, namely that they could read the words well and fluently, but just didn't know what they meant. In fact, that about 30% of kids in Boston middle schools could not read fluently, needed help with fluency, as well as with vocabulary, background knowledge, and comprehension. So the RISE, in turn, gave rise to STARI, the Strategic Adolescent Reading Intervention, which is a heavy-duty reading course that is being delivered and evaluated in English language arts assessments. At the same time, all of this work, we were reminded of the need for internal coherence in the schools we were working with. If they couldn't do a good job of implementing of using the data from the assessments or implementing the interventions, then obviously the quality of the intervention wasn't worth very much. So my colleague Richard Elmore and Michelle Foreman started working with the support of Carol Johnson with school leaders in many of these schools to try to promote a sense of leadership and internal coherence. That in the process of observing word generation classrooms and STARI classrooms, we came to the realization that vocabulary was the least of the issues here, and that the real active ingredient in the word generation curriculum was discussion, active, engaged classroom discussion. That led us to apply for and get funding for a much more enhanced version of both word generation and STARI. We call it Word Generation Plus. And we're working on that right now, again, in collaboration with Boston and other districts. So these products are responsive both to predefined needs and to emergent needs. They were co-designed in many cases with teachers and administrators, built to respond to local conditions, but they have traveled quite widely. Word generation is being used and formally evaluated in Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and San Francisco, but it's been adopted in dozens of other districts by initiative of the teachers or superintendents in those districts. RISE has been used across all the middle schools in Baltimore. It's being used in the very large $120 million Reading for Understanding network that the Institute for Education Sciences has just established. It's being used in Brockton and a number of other districts. So this work has generated $22 million in grant funding, and you could say that's been a very good thing. However, I am, of course, going to say it isn't nearly enough. That one of the major challenges that we have is the one that was brought up this morning by Anthony Braga, that there is no funding for partnerships. The funding is to do the work, and the funding can often drag you away from the focus that the partner district wants you to have. So an endowment or a recognition on the part of the Central Funding Agency for Educational Research, IES, of the need to fund field sites is a crucial need if this sort of work is going to go on. IES has embraced the notion that they will only give funding to researchers who have partnership relationships, but they haven't embraced the recognition that that somebody needs to fund those partnership relationships. I think a few of the other challenges, and I'll be interested to hear Carol Johnson respond to these. One is that there are multiple actors within BPS, and different people might be talking to us but not to each other. There is the problem that public school time and academic time, different calendars completely. And BPS is a very large and complex organization with a lot of agendas. SERP activities are not always right at the top of those agendas. And I think partnerships, good partners would help each other try to focus energies on issues of highest need, but also to create synergies across a wide array of such undertakings. And so I hope that SERP can help BPS do that. But at the same time, I think the promise of this approach is that we have already demonstrated is we have more usable and better engineered products than most educational researchers have been able to produce. I think we've had the capacity to attract into educational research activities academics who weren't very interested to begin with, but they see the power of this model. We're preparing doctoral students at the Ed School to work in new and better ways with schools, much more sophisticated approaches to school research. And I think we're contributing to the reduction of faith in simple solutions to these complex educational problems. If you're interested in more information about SERP or about the word generation curriculum, you can go to those websites. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Next up, we have Carol.
Good afternoon. I'm going to stay right here and try to speak fairly quickly because I am hoping that we'll have some opportunity for interchange. I first want to thank Steve for being here from the University of Chicago. I have to say that the work that they've done in Chicago has been useful not just in Chicago, but to a number of us working in a number of areas. The work they've done on the synthesis of looking at essential elements in a school, the early work that they've done to really focus on what happens when you retain students who don't pass a test over time. And I think that there are a lot of lessons learned from that research in Chicago that apply really to all urban schools. Boston is really a higher ed rich environment, and so to try to have a conversation about how the city connects with this rich environment is probably a complex conversation to have. But what I'd like to do is really focus on how we partner to produce the results and the knowledge that we think will benefit us. And I want to talk maybe in sort of 3 different segments. One about the academic supports, another one about the social service network of supports that are needed, and then finally, the institutional capacity of the Boston Public Schools to get better itself in what it delivers. And I think that in all 3 areas, the higher ed community can be extremely important. We already are doing a lot on the academic front. We do a lot with preparation of principals through the Harvard Principals Program. Boston College established a principal leadership program that kicked off this summer that it includes charter school leaders, Boston Public School leaders, as well as people who work in private schools, Catholic schools. And so I think there are a number of ways in which school leaders are being developed through some of these partnerships. We have a number of things under, Catherine just described SERP as one of the major initiatives that we have around literacy, particularly adolescent literacy, and I think that we're learning some lessons that are broader than just about reading, but how a whole school works together to create a set of conditions under which knowledge, research, and data can be used productively. And I think that the lessons we've learned is that when you take just isolated things without the context of the entire school community, and the school in particular, and the leadership capacity, that presents a whole set of challenges, I think, to implementation. Northeastern University supports us with AP Physics and Chemistry Summer Bridge programs. The Harvard Medical School supports our AP Summer Bridge program, which extends into the school year with Hinton Scholars. And the University of Massachusetts supports our AP Environmental Summer Bridge program, as well as AP Biology and AP Chemistry. So we have a number of partnerships that are very much focused on students and student learning. The mayor invited 5 universities to work with some of our turnaround schools, very intentionally, what we call the superintendent schools. And so we really have had a lot of support, I think, on the academic support area, although I will say that, and maybe this echoes some of what Catherine referenced, is we don't have these all put together in a way that would help us identify the synergistic or the leverage of all of the different things that are going on. The social science area, and social services rather, everything from our health and wellness work, our youth risk behavior surveys that we've conducted, Boston Connects from Boston College, where we've done a lot of work with bringing in people who are like social workers, but who do brokerage in schools, because we know that our students need academic support, but a lot of students are in very traumatic and very difficult family situations, and how do we provide the mental health and other social network of supports for health services and other things. And that model, the City Connects or Boston Connects, has been really a critical player in that. And I think that we believe that also sort of embedded in some of the work that we're doing with early childhood can be efforts around the neuroscience areas of how the brain develops and how learning can take place. And then institutional capacity. So one of the things that I think is very difficult is this. A lot of people want, for example, access to data. And we live in a community where there are a lot of people doing their doctorates and they're doing their master's programs, and we're approached by individuals. We're also approached by organizations, nonprofits. We live at a time when a lot of the funding organizations want proof. They want results. They want, in order to fund either higher ed institutions or nonprofits, they want somebody to give them evidence that something mattered. And then the agency or the university faculty have to come back to us and say, did what we do, did it matter? And we've been trying to shift from a research and evaluation assessment department that's been very test-focused to one that looks at these questions very deeply. And I think that really what Sarah described with the strategic data partners gets us closer to creating the kind of internal capacity that will be necessary for us to partner effectively and be responsive to some of these data requests. And I think the big win on that is that it's not just that they assign 2 strategic data partners to us, but they take those 2 data partners, 4 that we have now, and they're going back and forth and they're networking with other partners that they have around the country. And so they're building a set of knowledge around what's working in urban schools that is going to be extremely useful, I think, in terms of how data gets used. And we've been very pleased with the support that we've been given in that regard. But so let me say that I think among the challenges and the barriers that we face in terms of building better connections between our higher ed partners are these. So one, and I think Catherine alluded to it, we have a central point of contact for our research, evaluation, and assessment division, but it doesn't have the capacity to interact as easily with the large volume of people who want to partner. So what people do is they go to the individual person that they happen to know, in the organization, and it may be a science educator, it may be a principal leadership person, and they network with that person. And so there may be powerful things going on, but synthesizing and putting together a portfolio of results has been more difficult because it has been more fragmented. And so I would say that as people write grants or things to NSF, recognizing that unless we are able internally to build capacity to help and work with you, it is very difficult for us to assume the entire responsibility for generating the kind of data that you want to help support or even regularly report on the interventions that are being tried. And so we have to partner together to make sure that we figure out how this capacity building works, not just for your short-term project, but for the long-term work that will improve schools effectively. I think that one other critique that Catherine identified that I think is really very important, and that is the district has to work against being so fragmented and distracted by many other issues that come up in an ongoing way that are sometimes political, sometimes they're neighborhood, sometimes they're incidents that occur in the community, and how we work in a more coherent way so that our partners know who to call and can connect with us in a very real way. Very often, I think that the approach that external folks take with us is very isolated. So people come to us with a particular thing that they want to work on. And so it may be about some social service that we provide. It may be about an academic area. And we're trying to work to turn a whole school around. Or sometimes they want to work with 3 schools. And we're trying to see how that work in 3 schools can be replicated to the whole, because there's limited time and limited resources. And so I think we have to have a conversation about how to select and prioritize those high leverage questions that we have that really are important and urgent for us to answer, but at the same time, help you delve deeply into the kind of research work that will help influence what we do. I do think that the speakers that you've heard today identify the fact that there is knowledge, there is research out there. I think that it isn't always accessible easily to our teachers and our principals. And we have to build networks of learning where we are constantly, not unlike the old agricultural models of farmers learning, we have to figure out how we're going to constantly be informed about the latest and most successful research that has been conducted that will really help us change our practice. And I think we are, I was struck by Steve's example that I think he said we have to abandon the privacy of the classroom. And I think we are working to abandon the sort of sole ownership we have for what happens in our schools, recognizing that without the collective resource and attention that our higher ed partners and others can bring, we truly can't be successful. So I'll stop there because I'm sure that there'll be other questions and more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. What an interesting group of discussions and papers. I just want to highlight what I saw as 3 areas that kind of cut across as I've been thinking about this relationship between school districts and universities, and also in my own research, doing research on parent-school relationships and family-school relationships. And the first thing that seemed to come out, I think was best characterized by Steve in thinking about this as a cancer, to think about this as seriously as we think about finding a cure for cancer, that every time we wait, every school year that passes, another kid moves forward, another cohort is lost. And so there's this need to deal with the immediate while we think about the long-term solutions. And as we look at the changing job market, and our need to be globally competitive as a country, there's a need to really focus on the STEM areas, on science, technology, engineering, mathematics, so that our population will be prepared for the jobs of the future. It's not enough to inspire the best and brightest, but we have to raise the bottom so that everyone can move in a world that's increasingly technological. And so I think about some of the issues that Carol raised around just not having the capacity to deal with all of the requests that come for data and things like that, and how can the university help manage some of those requests, streamline some of those requests, even use data in ways to answer some lower level or more easily answered questions before digging into the deeper and more long-term kinds of solutions. So I was very interested in thinking about and having the panel think about this kind of accessibility of research. And often as researchers, we come in with these ideas that we have. We've thought about them. I'm a researcher myself. And we think about these questions and we come in, and we're happy to give back our results, but how do we answer the question that the teacher or the principal has that day, that they need to deal with something that afternoon or the next morning? They can't always wait for our data. And the second thing that I actually asked the panelists early on to think about is, what is the ideal collaboration? And as I listened to the panelists today, these are all success stories. We don't have anyone up here talking about how they knocked on the door of the school district, or if they're a researcher, or they see the university across the street and they know they can help, but they have not been successful in building that relationship. And so how do we think about moving beyond the one-by-one established relationship, the going around the system, calling the person you know to circumvent the system that's overloaded, to building an infrastructure that will bring more people at the table with less time spent on individual interaction? So how do we think about the infrastructure? How do we think about an ideal collaboration that's broader than a one-by-one established relationship? And the third thing that I think is partially unique to the schools that I'd like the panelists to think about before we open up the floor for questions is, with schools, we're dealing with children who are compelled to be there legally until a certain age. And with children, they bring families. And when you think about data about children, you have to think about parental permission to release data and identity and things like that. And so one of the missing partners in this kind of partnership is, how do we bring the family to the table? How do we think about partnerships between the school and the university that can support the relationship between schools and families, to give families more information and data so that they can make informed decisions? How do we help families do things at home to support the school? In each of the presentations, we've talked about this idea of what happens in early education that either prepares or ill prepares students for education. But how do we help, as a partner, bring families to the partnership and help schools serve families? And so those are the things that I saw that cut across, and I'd like to invite the panel to either respond or ask questions of each other for a moment or two, and then we'll open the floor for questions.
Well, I'm going to make one other comment, and I'm going to give an example. The Harvard Business School and the Harvard Graduate School of Education partnered to create something called the Public Education Leadership Program. And they took about 9 to 10 urban school district teams, and for the last maybe 6 or 7 summers, they brought them together to really think about school reform and using, the case study methodology to help lessons learned in a more systems approach. I think 2 things about that. One, it was designed to really build capacity within those urban systems with teams of people from those systems, so they could bring a problem of practice to the training that they could work on deliberately that was very relevant to the work. And secondly, it's enormously difficult for 2 departments in a university to work together, I have found. So I would, to the extent that the partners can choose to work collaboratively together as they intervene with us, it really has a very, I think, powerful and synergistic impact on the work that we do. And I would just suggest that whether it's across the social services network or the education network, we are working holistically with children, and their development isn't isolated into departmental boxes. And so we have to think about how, even if you're in a specific discipline, your discipline relates to other disciplines that might be appropriate at certain times.
I'd like to say something about the STEM question. So there's a young man at University of Pennsylvania named Park Yoon-jun, who has done very interesting research internationally. So, you know, among the OECD, the developed nations of the world, we tend to score around the 35th or 40th percentile. If you compare the distribution of achievement in math to, let's say, South Korea, our top 10 percentile kids are about maybe 20, I'd say 0.2 standard deviations, which is a sizable difference, but not massive. Our kids are that far behind the South Korean kids. At the bottom, it's 75% of a standard deviation. So there's a vast difference between how well our poorest achievers are doing, and that's what we look at when we compare the U.S. to other countries. So if we could improve the bottom end of our achievement distribution, we would go from the 35th percentile much, much higher in that distribution. It's really a problem of inequality that's bringing our mean down. But I want to emphasize how deeply structured I think this is in the very fabric of American schooling, and here's why. Well, we know that elementary school teachers are not, known for being gifted in their mathematical subject matter knowledge. I mean, that's not why they went into elementary teaching. There's a lot of anxiety about math. There's a lack of subject matter knowledge. Yet, what we do is we have a system in which each teacher is expected to go in the privacy of her own classroom with the door shut and basically invent a mathematics instructional regime using just a textbook. And if you've seen these textbooks don't tell you how to teach. They just give you a massive amount of information. To learn how to actually make a class effective, to have effective assessments of kids that are mathematically accurate. Heather Hill at Harvard is doing some very interesting research on how inaccurate the basic instruction is in math that kids are receiving. We cannot afford to have each teacher working autonomously and privately without guidance, without information, given the state of knowledge of those teachers in mathematics. It just doesn't work. And that's not the way the countries that are successful operate. They have, top to bottom, they have a national examinations, they have a national curriculum, a national examination system, and people are trained in teaching what's going to be taught on the examination, and they have tremendous amounts of guidance and tremendous amounts of collaboration among teachers in how you do that kind of instruction. So our decentralized system, which is decentralized, is sort of a fractal. It's decentralized in its governance, and within the school, it's incredibly decentralized in terms of individual teachers working alone without guidance. We're not going to solve the problem if that's the way we organize schools. We have to radically rethink how the work of teaching is done and how schools are organized, and I think that's why we need to create model schools that have a very different and much more systematic approach to how you do instruction.
Our customer, we would say, is less teachers and folks in the classroom. I couldn't agree with everything that Steve said more. So I would say my comment with the fear that it's going to take us off point a little bit. But we really design our work and determine that it needs to be compelling to people like Carol Johnson and her colleagues across the country. So we're looking at those sort of system level decisions and interventions, and what we, in terms of making the research accessible, what we're pushing hard on, and Carol can tell us if we're succeeding in this, is using the visual display of data very differently to make it compelling, easy to understand, to kind of hit that spot. I think Deborah Allen said it earlier beautifully today, that there's this penchant for quick fixes, but also this slowness to change. So we want to try to design what we put in front of leaders to kind of hit that spot that it's compelling enough to act on, and build into their decision making that's where we're aiming to try to make that research accessible. I will say that our fellows struggle with this mightily in the school districts in terms of, doing research, but then it doesn't work unless other people they can relay it to their colleagues and their peers and to people they're working with in the system. So one of our lessons learned, I think, is less is more.
So let me respond to this issue about what's the ideal collaboration. And obviously the ideal collaboration is the one that lasts and that serves the needs of both members of the partnership, but also I think one that probably none of these collaborative efforts have yet fully, some criteria that they haven't yet lived up to, which is that they really do change it's the one that Steve is alluding to, change the nature of the institution, right? That in 20 years we won't be going to schools and hearing, I don't know what to do about kids in middle school who can't read, right? That there will be an accumulation of tools, of artifacts, of curricular approaches, of a loci of knowledge that can be transferred from district to district that will actually change. And there will be expectations on the part of school districts, teachers, principals, that people in universities not only could help them, but that they actually can help them, and that they're willing to help them, that the relationships are institutionalized to the extent that it's a normal thing to do. The issue of families is a very important one, and I think it's a whole new agenda in a way. From our point of view, families are simply the people who won't sign the permission forms. And
there's so much more.
And indeed, of course, they have they have a much larger role to play, ideally. But every one of those questions becomes then an entire new domain for forging partnerships.
I think there's something, I think the theory of action that we struggle with a little bit is this. There is an increased demand for autonomy and flexibility with the notion that, and maybe it grows out of our experimentation with charter schools, but that this independence and this autonomy and flexibility will be the remedy for underperformance in schools. And I think that it has to be balanced against creating a team of educators who really work together and create a culture of using knowledge to influence their practice. And so if you create the autonomy and flexibility without the, I guess, the infrastructure to develop the skills, knowledge, and the inquiry capacity of educators to thoroughly ask and answer questions, I'm not sure that we will get to achieving the achievement gap closing goals that we have in terms of the gaps in achievement between our Black and Latino kids and our white and their white and Asian peers, because I think that we struggle with this notion of academic freedom, but we don't struggle enough with creating the kind of space where deep work goes on and dialogue with, I think, researchers about the practice part of it. And I think one thing that has happened in SERP, I think, has been in these schools where this deeper conversation is going on or taking place, there is more of a reliance on research and data, not solely what we think or what we feel like might be a good thing for kids. I think it challenges us somewhat more, and so I think it's that kind of capacity that has to be really embedded in the learning community we create.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions, very quickly.
I think this is for Catherine and possibly Carol and maybe Stephen, but I'm Barry Bluestone. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. We researchers do all kinds of research and we give all kinds of good ideas, we hope, to people, but it sounds to me like what we face often is the implementation problem and the cultural barriers to it, or the institutional barriers, either posed by long-term school practice or by collective bargaining agreements or what have you. And I'm wondering to what extent you found that you can overcome those by the work you're doing, and what might be some of the secrets that make it easier to break down old practices, cultural barriers, and institutional barriers.
Well, let me talk about one very specific case, the barrier that we're facing in doing an evaluation, an experimental study, evaluating an enhanced version of this vocabulary curriculum where the active ingredient is classroom discussion, right? There's a vast amount of evidence that kids learn more when they're talking than when they're listening, that they learn more from reading texts with a purpose and a question than just because it's assigned as the chapter for the week. But this classroom discussion piece, is there a teacher education program in the country that teaches teachers how to organize a classroom discussion? No. It is absolutely not in teacher repertoires to do this. So we are asking them to do something that nobody knows how to do, and what's the approach? Do a 2-week summer institute in how to run a classroom discussion? That's an approach that has been proven not very effective. So we're sort of betting on the support of very rich curricular materials, of really engaging questions, and micro changes. So look, for a week, just try this. Just try saying, when a student says something, just try, could you tell me more about that? If you do that to 10 students every day, they'll start telling you more. And once they start talking, then you can say, what do you think about what she just said? And then they discover they have to start listening. Well, when you've got students talking and you've got students listening, you've got the sort of basics of discussion. But this is a massive change in classroom practice that the entire institution of teacher education and professional development is not designed to help us solve.
Do we have time for one more question and then one quick question? And the red pants there, Jen.
I'm curious.
Can you tell us your name?
Oh, sure, Kathy Raboul. I'm curious, sort of, looking at the early panel and this panel. I know that a number of the kids in Boston, unfortunately, are educated in the Department of Youth Services. Has there been people that are researching the education specifically of the Department of Youth Services, or doing the looking at the academics within that system? I know that there was an article in the Commonwealth magazine that was not too complimentary of that system.
Are you talking? I want to make sure I understand your question. So are you asking if the Department of Children's Services, Youth Services, has researched, sorry.
Well, I'm just wondering, it seems like there's a lot of effort to do research in Chicago and all these different places. Are people researching the education in that system?
I don't know.
Or funding research in that institution?
No idea.
Because those are kids that also want to get a good education for those youth too.
Yeah.
There are, I think, but I'm not sure you asked the right panel.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. We can't.
I think you're asking that students who are placed in youth services facilities Who's researching the trajectory for them and their learning and their futures? Like, are we maintaining a database? And I don't really know the answer. I think that we do keep really extensive records of students who come and go into our system. And some of the students that are in, obviously, youth services are students from Boston. We re-enroll some students who come back from, some probationary or something that they've done, and try to integrate them into either one of our alternative programs or a program that seems suitable for them. To the extent they're counted in our total numbers, yes. But I don't know. I guess I do want to say one thing, though, about data. And I think that sometimes it's really important to work at helping teachers use data in a way to direct their practice, but to learn. And so very often the traditional information about data, which shows the disparities between how some students are doing and how others are doing, leads adults to conclude that the problem is with the kids and not with what we're doing to educate them. And I was reminded of this most recently because Adam Gray is one of our high school teachers, and he's a Teacher of the Year this year for the Commonwealth. And he's only taught 5 years, but he said that when he first began teaching, he had a very difficult time with his class. And he described it as he thought these kids, there was something wrong with the kids, that these kids simply were not committed to learning. They did not put in the energy and the time. They didn't seem to put in the effort. And it just so happens that sometime during that year, he had to go down and visit another teacher's room during his break. And when he walked in the classroom, he realized those were all his kids in that same teacher's classroom. And they were very engaged in academic work. They were very focused. They were answering questions. They were really putting in enormous effort. And he left that room almost dejected, thinking, all this time I have been attributing the lack of student engagement to these kids, that there's something wrong with them in Boston. And he said, then I had to, after school, I went to this teacher and I said, I need to learn from you what you're doing, because I have the same kids, just an hour before you do. And I can tell you they don't behave for me the way they behave for you. They don't engage in the work that you're doing. And so I think that part of what we have to not only do is we have to create conditions where teachers look at data in a comparative sense, where we can see from school to school similarly situated kids, but where learning is taking place in very different ways. We have to put in front of teachers the data, and then we have to give them the kind of tools, I think, that you've heard described here, that give them the capacity to actually teach well. Because I think teachers want to do a great job. They don't always have the tools. And then from the partnership perspective, they have to believe that we're going to sustain the effort, that this isn't just something that's going to be here today, gone tomorrow, be here, try new things. They have to believe that we're going to use sustainable efforts, and that we're going to, really base it on accurate data with some reasonable assurance that what they're trying is worth trying and that they will get results, or we'll learn that we have to change practice. But I don't think we've created the conditions always for that learning to take place.
Thank you.